Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you for coming, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome Mukund Raghothaman to this interview loop and to his first talk this morning. So Mukund's talk is about regular programming over data streams. He's a student of Rajiv Allur from UPenn, and he has actually done a couple of internships with MSR Cambridge earlier with Microsoft Research. Besides that, he also did an internship with the Visual Studio team in 2009 doing a Scope plugin. So he has actually done 3 internships all in all. Today, his talk is actually part of 2 loops. So it's an interesting case where actually he has 3 days of intensive interviews. The first 2 days are for us. This is for postdoc position in RISE or MSR in general. And the last day is for Sumit's group. So it's quite intense. And yeah, so please give a warm welcome to Mukund. And I don't want to take more of his time. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Magus. Thanks for attending this talk. So this is work that will be described in my thesis. But really, like most theses nowadays, it's a result of a collaboration with lots of people. So my advisor, Rajiv Allur, Loris D'Antoni, Dana Fisman, Adam Freilich, Sanjeev Khanna, and Kostas Mamouras. Magus already mentioned a bit about me, but I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. I work with Rajiv Allur over there. I graduated in 2010 from the IIT at Guwahati. A one-sentence description of what my research is about how do we make programming easier. I've taken a couple of different looks at this. I've looked at this question in a couple of different ways during the last 6 years. My thesis itself is about how do you make new programming abstractions. But the work that I did at MSR Cambridge, for example, was how do you do natural language code search? So how do you build better tool support to help programmers in their daily lives? But let's return to the topic of this talk, which is about how do you express queries over data streams? So data streams are becoming extremely commonplace nowadays. Here you can probably see a small computer network. Lots of data streams over here. Servers get lots of traffic. Users searching for items, requesting web pages. So this browsing activity itself forms a data stream. What user requested what web page when. If you take an extremely microscopic look at a router itself, that is processing data streams. It's getting a sequence of packets on one side and it's performing various actions, forwarding packets to various other sides, on various other ports. So these are also working with data streams at some level. We are not the first people to actually think about data streams. Linear Road is one of these classical database stream processing benchmarks. I have this. So the setting is that you have traffic sensors on a road network, and there is a car at position X. A car at position X, the traffic speed was 20 kilometers per hour. There is an accident at position Z. A stream of such events, and then you might want to make decisions based on this. How much toll do we charge users? Do we discourage users from using this section of the road? So really, if you look at what the server would be doing, it would be getting a sequence of events on one side, and it would be outputting a sequence of tolls on the other side. So it's making decisions based on this on data streams. In fact, there is the whole the Internet of Things is coming up. So everything in the houses, in typical apartments, are getting automated. When does a person leave the apartment? When does a person come back to the apartment? What do pets do? You have pet cameras nowadays. When does it enter the kitchen? So you can ask questions like, on average, how long does John leave the apartment during the day? What is the length of John's longest trip outside the house? Questions like this of data streams. So this talk is about how do you ask such questions and how do you answer these questions. Let's actually fix a particular example for the rest of this presentation, which is, let's say you're working with a with a model bank. So a single customer makes a sequence of transactions, and this data stream itself is the sequence of transactions of the customer with the bank. So he deposits $12, he withdraws $5. Whenever you see a D, it means that the business day has come to an end. Whenever you see an M, it means that the calendar month has come to an end. You might ask lots of questions of this data stream. One such question would be, what is the maximum daily deposit that the customer makes? What is the total deposit that the customer makes over each day? What's the maximum overall months of this peak activity day? This is a very natural query that a data analyst might ask. How do they typically answer this? So nowadays, I think the most straightforward way that programmers approach a question like this, it's not a very difficult question. It's not a very difficult program to write. It's a small stateful loop saying I initialize the state. For each transaction that I see, I update my state in some way, and at the end, I return some output. But again, the programmer has to manually reason about what state needs to be maintained, what updates need to be performed after reading each transaction. This is how the programmer implements it, but what do programmers actually think about when you are actually asked this question? Average over all months of the maximum total daily deposit. They actually think in terms of abstractions that are more high level. They think in terms of regular expressions. A sequence of transactions of a day, a sequence of transactions of a day followed by the end of day marker, T star D. A sequence of transactions for lots of days followed by the end of month marker, T star D the whole star M. They're thinking about parsing the data. And then they think about computations that performed on this sparse tree. So there is this gap between how they're thinking and what they actually need to write, where what they write is straight line code like this, whereas how they're thinking is of visualizing the data like this. So really this talk is about how do you express these kind of structured queries over data when the data itself does not carry any structure on it. So asked another way, we are all familiar with what regular expressions are. They express properties of language. They express languages. So they take a data stream and they return true or false. Either the stream satisfies some property or it fails the property. What are regular expressions for functions? How do you combine functions in what is this set of combinators that allow you to combine functions, just as regular expressions allow you to combine languages? So the answer that we will be giving is an extension called quantitative regular expressions. Let's look at it with the same bank transaction data. So we said that this was the sequence of transactions of a single day, T star. So I'm able to say, okay, iterate over all transactions of T, combine the results using the operator plus. So sum up the transactions of a single day. That's what F does. G, make sure the sequence of transactions is ended with an end of day marker because it's the T star D. So apply F to this part, sum up the transactions of the day, take the end of day marker, map it to the constant 0, and then just add f and the output of d. So this function over here is this function g is defined only for streams that end with a d, and in that case, it's basically the sum of the transactions itself. The maximum deposit over the month. So h takes lots of days as its input, applies g to each single day, and combines the result using the operator max. So max over here plus, these are operators in the cost domain. These are ways to combine numbers. These operators, iter, split, these are ways to combine functions. The sequence of the transactions at the end of the calendar month, there's an end of month marker. So take the maximum over all the transactions of a month, map the month itself to 0, and add the two results. And really, this was the query that we were interested in. Average over all months of k. So the final answer, the final query that we really want to write is iter of k, combine the results using average. What are we doing here? We are really building up functions. We are gluing functions together using these small set of combinators that I have given you. What am I not telling you? I am not telling you how to do the parsing. I'm just saying that there is a way to split it into individual months. The transactions of a month, I can somehow split it into individual days. I do not tell you how. I just tell you that you should. So this leads to natural. So this is a declarative programming style. So it should naturally lead to a question of how do we actually evaluate these functions in your mind, and that will be the focus of half of this talk. How do we evaluate these functions on their own? But before we do that, let's just actually write down the combinators and make sure that we are speaking the same language. So the basic combinator that you saw was split. I have a long data stream over here. I split it into two parts, a prefix and a suffix. I apply e to the prefix, f to the suffix, and combine the results using this combinator op. What does this remind you of? I mean, it is regular expression concatenation. There is just one major difference though, which is that in regular expressions, you're usually not interested in this notion of unambiguity. So what would have happened had, what am I telling you? I'm saying split the data stream, apply e to the prefix, f to the suffix. I am not telling you how to split it. And in particular, if there are multiple splits, then it is unclear which function, which of those two things you wanted. So what we require is that it should be unambiguous. There should be a unique way to split this. And only then is the function defined. So unambiguity is generally an important theme around functions. You're not interested in does one parse tree exist? You want to be sure is there a unique parse tree?
Does that restriction limit the ability to modularize these declarative programs? Because you need it's a property of the whole program, not of any piece.
It is a property that comes up in a modular way. So each sub-expression has to be unambiguous. If any particular sub-expression is ambiguous, then we say that the whole...
previous expression, I would have to know that the summing of the transactions doesn't include, the day marker to be able to compose it with the. So I can't compose f into g. I can't use f and g unless I know that this is going to be unambiguous. I have to know what f is, the definition of f.
Oh, so there is an analysis tool that we have, part of the whole tooling that looks at g and certifies that yes, this is unambiguous. It can be done in polynomial time with some clever algorithms. Turns out we don't even need to do that, do the silly things, and you will still end up, the silly exponential algorithm is still fast enough for.
So you're saying it has to be unambiguous not on this particular data, but it has to be probably unambiguous on any input. So
there are two ways to put it. There are two ways about it. there is the dynamic way, which is to say that on this stream it is unambiguous, which was the approach that we took in the initial few papers on this topic. Later on, we took a more heavy-handed approach, which is to say across all data streams it has to be unambiguous. And I'll come back to that question when we are talking about the evaluation algorithms. But yes, either approach will work. For ease, let's say it has to be unambiguous across all data streams. So it doesn't matter if there is no parse tree for some stream, but for each stream there has to be at most one parse tree. So we already looked at split. Iter is the next regular expression combinator is Kleene star. So I take the whole data stream, I split it into lots of parts, apply E to each part, combine the results using op. Again, defined only if the split is unique and it's unambiguous Kleene star. The next combinator is else. It's like regular expression union. If E of W is defined, then output E of W, otherwise output F of W. Now here, coming back to your question of is it static or dynamic, our definition here is very dynamic in some sense. But when we come to our evaluation algorithms, we'll demand that the domains of E and F be disjoint. Because
it's impossible that both E and F accept the same string.
it should be, so we politely request that E and F have disjoint domains. Otherwise, it leads to complications with how fast we can evaluate the stream. It's related to lots of problems, open problems regarding how do you match even regular expressions. Something that you don't see in regular expressions is traditionally is combine two functions itself. So maybe I have a sequence of transactions from a bank. Some of them are Alice's transactions, some of them are Bob's transactions. I want to find out who deposited more money, Alice or Bob. So max of Alice's total deposit, comma Bob's total deposit. So I take the whole data stream, pass it to an expression E, pass it to an expression F, combine the results using op. This is related to something in regular expressions which you traditionally don't see, which is language intersection. This is only defined if both E and F, so the result is only defined if both E and F are defined. Going back to unambiguity, really what we would require here is that E and F have identical domains. It does not, so I'm not saying they compute the same function if they have identical domains. So both Alice's total deposit and Bob's total deposit take the entire data stream as an input. They compute different things of their data stream. But in the regular expression world, this is language intersection. Now, what I have done in the previous few slides is really introduced a bunch of function combinators, split and iter and else. But I will also make a complaint immediately that those combinators don't generalize very well. What do I mean by they're not generalizing well? What if op over here, so this was the how you did split of E comma F. What if op was not commutative? What if you wanted to merge them in the other direction? Over here, this is the parse tree for iter. Split the stream into multiple parts, apply E to each part, combine the results using op. Traditionally, if you want something like this, you want that operator to be associative. What if op is not associative? And initially, you might think that, okay, maybe that is a very pedantic problem. That isn't. Subtraction is something that's not associative or commutative. And what if you really want to say total deposits minus total withdrawals? And these are combinators that people are actually interested in practice. So so we are speaking the same language here. When I say combinators, I'm usually referring to things in the QRE world, ways to glue functions together. So split, iter, combinators like that, and the operators themselves belong to the cost domain. So how do you combine numbers? Plus, minus, min, max, average, and so on. So this was one of the most important technical problems in the thesis that are there. How do you generalize this to work with arbitrary operators? So what we really want to say is that we want a language where we give you the combinators. You come to us, you tell us that this is the way you glue numbers, this is the way you glue values together. So you tell us the operators, we give you the combinators, and the whole theory just works. We can just combine the two agnostic to the operators that you choose. And a solution was really to think about what's happening with when you're evaluating these functions. So this was a sequence of transactions from the bank, and we parsed this sequence of transactions from the bank. So T star D was the transactions of a single day. T star D, lots of T star Ds become a T star D the whole star M. What did we then do? We wanted to calculate the maximum deposit. So we took this parse tree, and we simply replaced every node in the parse tree with some operator. So there was an end of day marker here, we replaced it with a 0. An end of day marker here, we replaced that with a 0. An end of day marker, we replaced with a 0. M replaced with a 0. T star there becomes a plus. T star here becomes a plus. T star D becomes a plus plus. T star D the whole star M becomes a max. So we took this parse tree that we got, replaced every node in this parse tree with an operator, and we got another expression tree, or let's say computation tree, which we then evaluated to get the answer. But really the way I defined them was that the combinators that I introduced, split and iter, they mapped a stream to a value. But actually when you're parsing it, what you're doing is this whole thing. You're parsing the data stream and then replacing each node in the parse tree with an operator. And then you're computing the resulting tree. So what the important generalization that we did was that QREs don't have to map things to values. They can map things to terms, to partially evaluated computation trees. What do I mean by that? This. The QREs that I described so far compute computation trees like that. They can instead leave unevaluated holes. So max of 1, p plus 3. And then somebody else can come in later and say substitute p with the value 2, or substitute p with the value 5. So what you get is an unevaluated expression tree as an output from a QRE rather than a single numerical value. So how does this work? This was how the previous split combinator was. I tell you what op to do to combine E and F. The more general split combinator is to say that there is a parameter P. E just maps, E evaluates to an expression tree, F prime evaluates to an expression tree, substitute in the parameter P of F prime the value E. So for example, what F prime should have been returning in the previous case was F minus P. If F prime returns the term F minus P, then this itself computes the expression split EF minus. If it returned, on the other hand, P minus F, then you would have been computing split EF minus with the other direction. So this is a generalization of how the split combinator should work, which works across all domains. So this is really QREs in their most general sense of the word. These are the basic functions. Just as you have basic languages, map a single element to some value, map the empty data stream to some value. Regular expression union doesn't change. Substitute the result of E into the parameter P of F. Substitute the result of F into the parameter P of E. A generalization for iteration as well. This gives you an additional combinator. Now, because we are returning terms, we can also do substitution over terms. And what this allows us, so what you will notice here is that there are regular combinators here. Nothing above this, this line over here is really speaking about numerical values. Nothing below this line is speaking about regular combinators as such. So there are two diverse worlds which are just glued together on the fly.
So in the first line, the basic functions, the phi really refers to the predicate of the values, not the values themselves. Okay.
Yeah, it can be predicates, exactly like symbolic automata. And lambda is any function on a single numerical value. So really, we got much more than what we initially wanted. I said regular expressions of function sigma star to bool, and then all the examples that I was giving were function sigma star to real numbers. Take this slide here. These were you were thinking of numerical operators, plus, minus, min, max. Think of strings and string concatenation. What you get is a way to combine strings to functions from strings to strings together. So pick up an arbitrary domain, instantiate the calculus on the previous slide, and you get a set of class of functions which is expressible. And we claim that the class of functions you can express is robust with respect to that choice of combinators. Now, so I described the QRE calculus to you. There is nothing more to the QRE calculus. If you're a programmer, that's what you need to know. But as researchers, we have two other questions that we are interested in. How quickly can we evaluate E of W? Because this is a declarative notation in an actual programmer. Imagine you had a stream of 1 million elements coming at you, and anything that's super linear, actual programmers are not going to use them. So ideally, what we want is just one online pass over your data stream, and we want to compute E of W. Second, as theoreticians, as people interested in programming languages, we want to know what kind of functions we can express, the semantics of. So the implementation details and the semantics, what functions can we express and what closure properties do these functions have. So this will be the remaining two parts of the talk.
So you talked about the quickness of evaluation. So there's also the memory state utilization.
Yes.
So do you actually worry about that? And
yes, we worry about that.
Okay, so you will cover that.
I will cover that.
Okay.
In fact, it's rather interesting. So if I go back a few slides, a bit of historical background. How this started was we gave a calculus for sigma star to gamma star first, contrary to what I described in the thesis. And then I give my thesis proposal presentation when somebody in the committee asked me exactly this question. And part of the generalization to sigma star to R was actually being very conscious about what memory usage we have. And really, I think what we have is the best answer that anybody could give. If we take an input stream and we are mapping an output stream, we have to store that output somewhere because you can do things like reverse a stream. So we cannot generate outputs online. So because we have to store the stream, we need linear memory. Sigma star to R, we can give you constant memory, depending on what combinators you use. So I'll come back to that. So how do you compute E of W? So let's pick up a simple QRE over here. What is this doing? You don't really need to understand what these QREs are. If the stream ends with a B, then just return the length of the stream. If it ends with a C, then return twice the length of the stream. Let's say this is the QRE of interest. So ideally speaking, what a programmer would have done would have been to manipulate the state by hand. figure out what state needs to be maintained, update it. So keep two variables, what is the length of the stream, what is twice the length of the stream, and manually reason about this. What control state do we need to maintain? So specifically for split E comma F, E is defined on a, so this is the entire stream, and let's say we are reading the stream left to right. At this point we say, aha, E is defined. We discover that. So we have to start evaluating F at that point. But we cannot stop evaluating E. Why? Because E may be defined on multiple prefixes. What did we say? E has to be defined on the prefix. F has to be defined on the suffix. Maybe this is the correct way to split the stream. If we had tried to evaluate F on this part of the stream, it would have been undefined. So when we cannot stop evaluating E just because we see a point where it is defined.
Can that happen when the split is provably unique?
Yes, it can. In fact, you can see it over here. So there is a split of A star. So let's ignore this whole part. This is an A star, comma B. So A star dot B. Now, when I see an A star, it matches it. I have to start evaluating the B. But if I don't see a B, that thread dies whenever I see a new combinator. So this can happen. But you are right to some extent, which is this. A generalization of what you say holds. If I think about it in terms of NFA evaluation and the streams are, if the expressions are unambiguous, the number of potential parse trees that I have is bounded by the number of states in this NFA. Because it is unambiguous, no two potential parse trees can reach the same state, because that would have demonstrated a static ambiguity. And so the number of potential parse trees that we have is bounded by the number of states in the NFA. It is independent of the length of the input stream. So I can see a million tuples in my stream, but I can still have just 6 potential parse trees. So we have bounded the amount of control state that we need to maintain like this. What about the intermediate result? So what did I say? That a QRE maps streams to terms, and these terms might be very large. How big can these terms get? So in the case of strings, we have to store the whole term. We cannot do anything about it. But if we are dealing with numbers over here, then we can apply basic algebraic rules. Evaluate common the completely specified sub-expressions. This, you don't need to maintain this subtree anymore. You can just maintain the number 5. You can apply distributivity. So you don't need to maintain this giant subtree. The plus 6, you can bubble it down, and you can instead store 10 plus 6, 16, and 6 plus 6, 12. So min of p plus 12, comma 6. So with this, what ends up happening is that each term with some number of parameters needs just a small amount of space to store the result. In fact, and so if the operators that you use are plus, minus, min, max, average, the space that you use is bounded by some polynomial size of the expression. But really, that's often not sufficient. Let's think about iter average, right? How would you? So I give you the stream of values over here, 2, 32, 12, 17, and then I say compute the average of this stream. How do you do this? You just need to maintain 2 bits of data. What is how many values have I seen so far? What is their sum? But let's think about a different query. what if you needed to compute the median? And there is this classical lower bound in online algorithms which says that you need a linear amount of memory to compute the median. Exactly. So what we end up, what we do is if we see a query with medians in it, then we don't maintain the entire stream. What we maintain is an approximate histogram of the distribution of data. So you give us an error bound, an error tolerance epsilon, and we compute the error to within a multiplicative error of 1 plus or minus epsilon. The space that you need is logarithmic in the range of values that you actually see in your data in that case.
This is a choice that you would make as a programmer, I assume. Which is to say, you could implement the linear one if you wanted, but you're just advocating that your users use something like this in order to control memory. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, so the algorithm that I outlined over here works with any representation of terms. In particular, when you have things like median, you could use a more careful representation, and if you're willing to tolerate error, you can get by with much smaller memory usage. So how it really works is that you give me the expression E, and we compile this into some kind of streaming evaluator. It is like an NFA, but maintains a little more state to maintain intermediate results. It makes just one linear time pass over the stream. Memory usage depends on what you're trying to do. At worst, linear, but in some cases, we can actually give you constant memory usage. If median is also used, then we can give you, and you're willing to tolerate error, then we can give you low memory usage even then. So let me do a little bit of switch and bait over here to show you the results. So this is how it actually, we implemented this algorithm not for sigma star to R, but sigma star to gamma star, string to string transformations. Very reasonably complicated transformations. How do you format BibTeX files, replace names of authors, and transformations like that? The expression sizes were things, the size of the AST was something like 3,000 to 4,000 for align BibTeX over here. And what I really want you to see is two things. First, linear time pass with the stream length. Second, what the throughputs that we are getting over here are still in the ranges of 10,000 kilobytes, 10,000 characters per second. And this is a very dumb implementation in some sense. So we did not optimize for performance, but we are still getting reasonably acceptable throughputs from this. And so I will switch tracks over here. I will ask another question. What functions can QREs express? Are we making good time? Yeah, I think 40 minutes. Okay. What functions can QREs express? This is coming as a programming language researcher, and when you saw sigma star to bool, we are very familiar with this from traditional theory of computation courses. Finite automata are stream acceptors. But how do you express functions as in an automaton model? So you could think of finite state transducers, sigma star to gamma star. But that doesn't work for sigma star to R. How do you compute? What kind of automaton model takes a stream and outputs a number instead? So a couple of years ago, we introduced this model called cost register automata. I won't describe this in a lot of detail, but what it really has are it's an automaton structure underneath. So there's a finite set of states. There are also a finite set of registers because it's computing an output.
Are you familiar with an augmented transition network?
I'm not familiar with what augmented transition networks are, but if they are what they sound like, then yes, these are very similar. Yeah. So really you have on transition M, you update T to T plus 1 and make a transition. These things have interesting closure properties. So I can do things like regular look ahead. I don't really need to say on transition M make this thing. I can say if the entire suffix that I have seen has some property, then make the transition. And I'm really not increasing expressive power at all. I can say things like, oh, give me the entire input stream in reverse. I can still compute the same function. So they're also closed under input reversal. So they're symmetric with respect to time in some sense. So they have nice closure properties. So finite automata in this classical result from the 60s, they're equivalent to formulas that you can write in monadic second order logic. Functions that you can express using this, using CRS, are equivalent to MSO definable string to term transducers. So if we accept that CRAs are the model for automaton model for functions, then the theorem in the main theorem in the paper in all the papers and in my thesis is that QREs compute exactly the functions that you can express using CRAs. I will not describe how this proof works in any detail actually. QREs to see converting these expressions into automata is a relatively straightforward task. It's just the way you would convert regular expressions into NFAs. Going the other way, converting NFAs into regular expressions is a slightly more involved thing. It's kind of like the Bellman-Ford algorithm. It is more complicated in our case because we are also dealing with data and data flows. So we have to set up this nested induction hypothesis, this nested induction about how these data flows work and make sure that take that into account while we're doing the compilation. But the ultimate theorem is that the functions you can express with QREs are the same functions you can express are the regular cost functions. So I will spend the last few minutes concluding the presentation. So what I described were quantitative regular expressions, and what they really are a programming abstraction to describe stream transformations. These when properties you want to express have this temporal nature, that end of days follow a sequence of transactions, end of month follows a sequence of days. QREs are a good fit for expressing functions in that setting. There were really 3 key ideas in the whole presentation, that you do not want to be mapping streams to numerical values. What you want to be mapping are streams to unevaluated terms, potentially with holes. If you want fast evaluation algorithms, then you want static unambiguity checking. So else F, you want the domains to be disjoint. If you want memory usage to be bounded, then you can use these term compression algorithms when you have just a few operators. And the main claims that we made were that the class of functions that you can use they're agnostic of the cost domain of interest. So if you're interested in numerical queries, then you can use the numerical operators. If you're interested in string transformations, you can use strings with concatenation, and you get a programming language for string transformations. It can express a robust class of functions. So it's not like you add extra features and you get a slightly more expressive class. They're closed under many of the traditional transformations you would think of on data streams. And we also present fast evaluation algorithms for this. So I'll present a few directions of future work. The most important thing that I want to work on now is the application of programming languages in automata theory to streaming data in general. Because streaming data, in particular, we have large data processing systems like Apache Storm, which are coming up. And so Apache Storm itself, in our view, describes how data flows around this network. What QREs are how do you transform a single stream of data? So I think that QREs would form an excellent way to actually program individual transformations in a large pipeline. What I have not talked about, and what I think is a very important problem, is how do you do joins of streams? Because joins are, I think, the fundamental problem with streaming data. How do you join two streams that are coming to you online? I think the connection to automata theory is actually with multi-tape automata. If you have two tapes and you can only go right on each tape, what kind of functions can you express? I think there are connections to be seen over there. Parallelizing QRE evaluation. So what I presented was a single-threaded model, and actually Margus's group here has worked on parallelizing some of these automata models with processor level, thread level parallelism. But really what we might also be interested in is data center level parallelism. So imagine we were writing code for google.com, and there are many servers which are hosting google.com. Some of the stream is seen locally here, some other part of the stream is seen locally here, and each server over here is seeing a physical subset of the entire stream, but logically there is a single sequence of queries to Google. Can we express this kind of data center level parallelism? Can we automatically evaluate QREs at that scale? Another question that has come up, in fact, with especially after Sumit's work on learning stream transformations, is can we learn these kind of QREs from input-output data? Because many data analysts are not really trained as programmers, and they may not want to use full programming language as such. They may want to give you input-output examples, and we want to learn from them. Slightly unrelated to all this is also the algorithms that I presented. They have application in the broader cyber physical systems community. So the setting is, imagine an automotive engineer working at Toyota. They are interested in properties of cars that they are building. So they express properties like the engine speed is always less than 5,000 RPM. These, because the real world is complicated, they often rely on simulations. But really what we want to see is how close is the engine RPM to 5,000. So if I give you two engines, one whose RPM is always less than 3,000, and another whose engine RPM goes to 4,500, the engine whose RPM is lower better satisfies this property, that the engine RPM is always less than 5,000. So can we, the calculus that I presented is a natural fit for expressing these kind of queries. How do can we help them in monitoring cyber physical systems online? I already did a bit of the generalization when I said we are not working with a single class of functions. You tell us what cost operators are involved. But there are other transformations. There are other cost domains where this is more involved. What if you had tree transducers, tree to tree or string to tree transducers? What do QREs look like in that world? But more broadly, if you ask me to describe what my research is about, it is about simplifying programming. So ignoring all the technical details in this talk, what I presented was a way to describe transformations over streams. Hopefully simpler than actually writing straight-line Python code or straight-line C++ code to do the same thing. So I've looked at this question in a few ways during the thesis itself. So new abstractions. the work that I did, in fact, at MSR Cambridge, which was how do you do code search with natural language? So instead of, for example, going to Google and asking questions like this, how do you read a file line by line? You ask this in Visual Studio, and what it gives you are pieces of code as output, rather than actually pointing you to web pages. Program synthesis as such, how do you, if I give you constraints on functions, how do you synthesize functions that satisfy those constraints? One particular question that I'm interested in right now is how do we use open source code corpuses, things like GitHub. GitHub did not exist 10 years ago. So we have seen a cultural change among programmers making their code open source. Can we learn from the way people actually write programs to improve program analysis tools? Can we give better program synthesis tools around this? So I'm actually excited, particularly interested in answering this question. One specific part of this would actually be going to search engines like Google and Bing and asking them, what questions do programmers actually ask about programming languages? That would actually help in knowing what kind of questions we need to answer. But really, ideally speaking, the research that I do has this blend of theory and pragmatism on both sides. So some of the thesis work itself raised a bunch of interesting theoretical problems. How do you do equivalence checking? And this led us, how do you solve constraints on strings? So these are all deep theoretical questions, which I also hope to answer in the future. Stop here. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions. So if you have any more questions, other than what you already asked.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that QREs and the automata are equivalent in terms of expressiveness. So the reason you would use QREs is because of the simplicity. Mm-hmm. So how do you evaluate that? I mean, what basis do you say that?
So the connection between QREs and CREs is exactly like the connection between regular expressions and automata. Of course, there is a deeper question over there over how we evaluate ease of use or programmer productivity. But if you accept that regular expressions are sometimes more natural than automata, then a similar reasoning would take you to QREs are sometimes easier to write than CREs.
Is it a matter of just compilation, perhaps, that you could compile one of like the QREs to the CREs, which could
yes. So there are you can compile QREs into CREs. I would not recommend that you do it because it's a non-elementary transformation.
What do you mean by non-elementary?
What I mean by non-elementary is the following. So I said that this is defined if and only if the split is unique. So when you went from regular expressions to NFAs, you don't really care about this. You just create an epsilon transition from this NFA to that. We need to actually add additional parts to this transformation to make sure that this check holds. But yes, if you actually think about what our evaluation algorithm is doing, it is doing something similar, but it is doing it lazily. It's not building up the state space explicitly. It is maintaining. It's a very on-demand reconstruction of the state space. So what we are really saying is that the number of states of the machine itself is exponential, but you can represent the states in a finite amount of space.
Right, but the evaluation of CRAs also do the same thing, right? They kind of build the states lazily. Because the register space, like you mentioned, is exponential. Mm-hmm. So evaluation-wise, it seems like they are quite similar. Is that right?
Which two are quite similar?
CRAs and QREs.
In some sense, yes, but a CRA would just have a list of the states. There's just a list, so you don't really need to do anything very smart to evaluate a CRA. You would still, if you're worried about how big the terms grow, then you would still have to do things like term compression, but it is just following the graph to evaluate a CRA. For a QRE, we actually need to build the graph as we are going along, and that is the complicated part.
A related question. Now, if you talk in terms of program synthesis and learning these representations, do you think QREs are a much more compact representation, or are there other sort of more compact representation you would search over?
I think QREs are a very good representation. What we would need to do, though, in fact, we have a work in progress about actually learning some of these things, is adding extra combinators. So right here, oops, it's a few slides down. Yeah, right here, I said that this set of combinators is complete. So in principle, you can, if you search over all expressions you build up using these combinators, you should have a good searching algorithm. To make it practical, we need to add syntactic sugar, yes. Functions that people generally express, like reverse a stream is a function that people generally express. Reverse can be written using these, but they are just these giant monolithic blocks that are generally useless to synthesize on their own. So just instead of having 10 combinators here, you would have 30 or 40, and you would learn with them.
There's a bigger question of does the designer specify these, or are these also learned over time themselves?
Yeah, so that is, we don't really, I can't answer that question yet. Our justification right now, so we were in the world of Bash, Perl and Sed and Awk. We said that by manual analysis of those programs, we know that there are these subroutines in Perl which we should express over here. So for example, regular expression deletion or things like that. So we just add those things because we felt they were important. But yes, there is who specifies those basic, the 20 extra combinators over here, who gives them.
And what are the benchmarks? Are there any data sets that you would want to evaluate against of these different type of tasks?
So there are lots of bash. That's another thing about GitHub. People write bash scripts and they upload them. Can we learn the same bash scripts? If those are the tasks that programmers actually want to do, we should perform well on those tasks.
How large are these bash scripts? I mean, how
pretty huge.
So how long will these need to be, the QREs?
So the QRE, so most things that programmers actually want to do are rather simple. So they're about expressions of size 30 or 40. So when I actually presented this graph of here, this is an expression of size 3000, but most things that programmers actually want are over here. But I think the deeper question that you want to ask is, is learning practical?
Yeah, exactly. For those kind of things.
For these kind of things, can we actually do the learning? Yeah. That is harder to answer. I think we can learn all the simplest things that programmers want to do and a few of the more complicated ones. There are lots of queries that throw our learning algorithm off, and that's why that's still work in progress.
So I actually have a question myself related to this, the learning aspect of this. So in your basic programs, you have the predicates, right? And of course, you have, at some point you need to learn these predicates as well. Do you take that as granted that you're given a set of predicates, or because that sort of takes it to a notch higher, makes it a notch more difficult?
Yes, so that is, I will answer this in, okay, so we were learning string transformations, and there are just a few simple string transformations that people actually want to do. Identity function, capitalize, lowercase. That is one way of actually figuring out these basic transformations, and the basic predicates are just things like is an alphabet, is uppercase, is a digit. But what we actually do, precisely because of this completeness issue, is we're learning from input-output examples. So we pick up all these predicates and we just filter them through the. So we have, if none of our examples contain any lowercase letter, then it is uppercase and is alphabet become the same predicate. So we filter these out, and we basically keep predicates for each individual letter, predicates across for all these important classes, is Latin letter, is Cyrillic letter, and all Boolean combinations that we can make from them.
So what I actually had more in mind was, suppose your character is not a character, but it's an integer or a rational, and you have sort of predicates over
that is a bigger open problem, right? In the program synthesis community. How do you learn symbolic automata? And I don't think there is a very convincing answer to that yet. So yes, that is something that I should have included. Right. Oops. Many slides down.
Yeah.
Right here. How do you learn symbolic automata?
One more question. So if you go back to your Bing code search, so what were the so there is some sort of machine learning involved in this part of the work. So what do you think, where machine learning can play a role in program synthesis, or generally in the problems that we were discussing?
So there are two parts to this. The tool that Jason and Yusuf and I were working on in MSR Cambridge was natural language code search.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of natural language processing involved in just taking this sentence over here and figuring out something that we as program analysis people can think about. So that is one part. How do you turn this entirely subjective sentence into some objective synthesis target? But even beyond that, there is a lot of machine learning that's involved in, for example, this particular query. Why did we choose this particular snippet of code over all other snippets of code that probably also did the same thing? So there is machine learning to be done over there. Otherwise, I was describing this to Margus earlier. People write code in Python and JavaScript all the time. These are statically untyped languages. But really, if I wrote a function for you like say def length of L blah blah blah, there is nothing formal over here saying that this is a list. But most programmers have that in mind, saying that this argument is a list, that the return type is an integer. These are not formal contracts, they are informal in the mental worldview, in documentation and all that. Can we learn this kind of, so there is some work on gradual typing for Python, but all that is again based on programmers making annotations on their own. Can we learn these things because we have so much code out there? So it's machine learning is not just involved in converting that, it's involved in finding out these little factoids about programmers.
So on that, what are your thoughts on what kind of models would be needed, or what have you already experimented with, or what would you want to do, or would you like to sort of investigate those sort of models?
Yeah, so this is extremely preliminary work in progress. I will not put my foot in my mouth, but these are what I think we really need to be doing is some kind of mixture. So how I actually view this is on two axes. You have how much code right, So we have things like GitHub over here, all the code that's available on GitHub. And then there are how much, I don't know, how much running, how many runs. So you have tools like Sage from MSR, you have tools like Daikon, which take a single program and basically run it across. So I think there are, so this is Sage and Daikon Swim, the Bing code search tool was over here. I think there is more to be done in this whole thing where you can say things like, aha, so can I build a worldview which says var L is equal to foo, and then length of L, and then I say something like, aha, so then I have a prior on L being L is a list. Probability of L is a list is equal to 0.2. Probability L is an integer is 0.01 or something like this. Can we automatically learn these kind of things because we see the way programmers usually write code, we see the way you are writing code. This is stuff that you can do because of GitHub. We should also be exploring what Sage and Daikon and projects like that do, which take a single program and run it to exhaustion.
Well, I think let's thank Mukund again for a great talk, and let's hope him best.